some larger strategic equity-related work, like implementing initiatives under our Canada Research Chair's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Action Plan on a day-to-day basis. I also provide some direct support to faculty members who are applying to funding opportunities that include equity, diversity, and inclusion components by offering things like direct grant reviews, creating supplementary equity, diversity, and inclusion tools and resources based on promising practices, and offering training workshops like this one. I'm going to mute my video for the duration of our presentation to make sure my internet cooperates. Again, as Adele said, I'll be answering questions at the end, but if we have quite a few questions and we aren't able to get to them all during the session, I'll have that follow-up FAQ posted as well. To provide you with an outline for today's presentation to get started, we're going to be starting off with the definition of key terms related to equity, diversity, and inclusion so that we're all starting from a common understanding. Then getting into some strategic alignment with embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion in some specific EDI related components for grants that you may be interested in applying to or have already applied to. And I'll note here that while many of the folks on this call are likely interested in understanding EDI components as they relate to grant opportunities, this is also, the best practices are very transferable, even if you're not in an academic environment or applying to the specific grant opportunities. Then to provide you with a brief overview of equity-related concerns in computer science, we're just going to be providing some specific data-related examples on underrepresentation in computer science. Then moving into some specific promising practices related to how to complete a gender-based analysis plus research design itself, and then some EDI best practices in the research team and training environment. And then finishing up with a bit of Q&A at the end. Let me clarify that there are multiple points in equity, diversity, and inclusion that may not be easy to differentiate between. And also, while you may be familiar with these concepts, it's very important to begin with a shared definition. And I will also note that many grants with EDI-related components have specific resource guides. So I would also recommend taking a look at how each define these terms, equity, diversity, and inclusion, because it will also give you a better sense of what areas they are focusing on. These definitions that I'm going to provide you with are adapted from the New Frontiers in Research Fund's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Best Practice Guide, which I find very good for providing not only some concrete examples and best practices, but also additional research if you're interested in learning a bit more. And that guide, along with several others, will be hyperlinked on the last slide of the presentation, which will give you something that you can refer back to as this presentation is being recorded if you want to take a second look at that. So to start off, equity is the removal of systemic barriers and biases, enabling all individuals to have equal opportunity to access and benefit from a program, policy, or practice. Equal opportunity is the section that I want you to focus on this definition, because equal opportunity is key as it may require the different allocation of resources to achieve the same access. And this is particularly important for individuals or communities that have faced systemic barriers or biases in the past and require additional allocation of resources to meet that same goal or to have that same inclusion in the research enterprise. Systemic barriers, which is a term found in the definition above, results from institutional level practices, policies, traditions, and values that may be unintended or unseen, but that still have serious and long-lasting impacts. To provide you with a specific example that may ground this a bit more, consider the example of if a tenure clock were not to stop for an early career researcher, faculty member who went on parental leave. If this were to be the case, that person would be disadvantaged by about a year or so if they were judged on the same standard of someone who had not taken that parental leave within that 5 or so year period. Another example is considering if lab space was built without accessibility in mind, so that an office environment did not have wide enough hallways or doorways for someone who used, say, for example, an electric wheelchair or scooter, or if it was not accessible by either ramp or things like an elevator. Diversity are differences in race, color, place of origin, religion, immigrant and newcomer status, ethnic origin, ability, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and age. Inclusion is ensuring that all individuals are valued, respected for their contributions, and equally supported to create an environment where all individuals feel they belong. In this definition, that sense of belonging or feeling of belonging is particularly important, and we'll also speak to why we want to look at building an inclusive team environment later when we're discussing equity in the training plan or equity in the team environment, because even if you've effectively recruited a very diverse group of excellent, highly qualified personnel, if folks are not feeling that they belong, then they're likely to switch out of that field or to switch to a different discipline where they do feel that they belong, which won't ensure that computer science, in this specific case, is benefiting from those who are the most talented or best for that research enterprise. When exploring inclusion, a term that you may hear also is equity-seeking groups. Equity-seeking groups are communities that face significant collective challenges in participating in society, which would also include the research enterprise. Research shows that members of equity-seeking groups have experienced a long-standing bias in areas such as recruiting, hiring, and training, and have been underrepresented in research, both in terms of the research design itself and in contributing to the research enterprise. Underrepresentation has led some groups to receiving unequal access to, and in some cases being excluded entirely from the research enterprise, which is why it's important to identify these groups. Members of equity-seeking groups include, but are also not limited to, women, folks in the LGBTQ2+ communities, racialized groups, Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, persons with disabilities, people who exercise cultural or religious practices, and any intersection of these identities. And when we say any intersection of these identities, that, for example, means a woman who's also Inuit, or someone who's a person with a disability who's also from a racialized group. So it's an intersection of one or more identities. It's important when you're building your training plan and considering equity, diversity, and inclusion more broadly in your research design as well, to have a sense of where the barriers and gaps are related to some of the equity-seeking groups that you identify as facing barriers in your specific context, because then you can identify concrete actions that are going to be most effective in addressing the specific barriers that are relevant to you. Moving on to specific grant alignment, it's widely held that embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion across the research enterprise contributes to more innovative and impactful research. And in recognition of this, a growing number of grant agencies have added requirements for embedding equity considerations in a number of key areas, including research design and reporting concrete actions to ensure an equitable training plan is developed, with attention to a few key areas, including team management and composition, recruitment and hiring, training and development, and an overall inclusive training or team environment for highly qualified personnel, which include undergraduate and graduate students and postdoctoral research fellows. So while I said a lot there, I'm going to, following in this webinar, be breaking down best practices related to each of those aspects. So we're going to dig into that a little bit further, but it'll just provide you with a basis of where we'll be going. In many cases, equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations are now also tied to merit indicators, which means that not only will embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion in the research enterprise genuinely support the contributions of equity-seeking groups, it will also be tied to funding. I have seen specific examples myself in my role at the University of Waterloo of grant applications that have been rejected due to a lack of sufficient attention to EDI requirements, So I'm sure a number of folks on the webinar today are drawn to this webinar, not only for better understanding specific grant requirements, but also that intrinsic need to make sure they are providing an equitable and inclusive environment for those HQP. To get a bit more specific, grants with EDI considerations include NSERC, including Alliance, Create, and Discovery, New Frontiers and Research Funds, and Innovation for Defense Excellence and Security. These are some of the grants that have specific EDI requirements. I'm going to focus on NSERC and New Frontiers for a moment, as these may be particularly grants that folks on the webinar today have applied for or will be applying to in the future. The Tri-Agencies Institutional Program Secretariat, which includes NSERC and administers the Interdisciplinary New Frontiers and Research Fund, is committed to excellence in research and research training. And through the Tri-Agency Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Action Plan, NSERC has stated that achieving a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive Canadian research enterprise is essential for creating the excellent, innovative, and impactful research necessary to advance knowledge and understanding, and importantly, to respond to local, national, and global research-related challenges. So it's important to understand that strategic connection to the overall mandate to understand why these EDI considerations are becoming more and more required in grant applications. Among other areas, the tri-agencies in their Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Action Plan are focused on a few key areas that we'll be digging into more here, including promoting the integration of equity, diversity, and inclusion related considerations in research design and practices, and increasing equitable and inclusive participation in the research enterprise, including on research teams. Again, the ultimate goal is an inclusive culture needed for research excellence and to achieve outcomes in research that are rigorous, relevant, and accessible to diverse populations. And relevance is a key consideration here, as research shows that research becomes more relevant when it does include considerations related to equity. Now, all of these, NSERC, New Frontiers, and Ideas, each have EDI resources and guidelines available to provide additional direction related to their specific requirements. And I want to emphasize that it's very important to pay attention to the specific requirements because expectations are not necessarily exact or consistent across all programs. For example, a description on equity, diversity, and inclusion in the training environment is not applicable if the question is really trying to ask researchers to consider equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations or to conduct a gender-based analysis plus of the research design itself. And I'm providing this example as this is a common mistake that I see when reviewing grant applications. Folks get so used to developing equitable training plans that they respond to a question on research design with this in mind rather than focusing on the research design itself, which is not necessarily what is being asked. So in the following slides, we'll be going over some specific examples of how to address these various EDI considerations more specifically. To provide another example before we move on of why reviewing requirements is so important is the difference in NSERC Create and New Frontiers requirements. NSERC Create asks PIs or principal investigators to report the gender balance of the team and to include a description of the gender representation in the discipline. So the discipline in this case would be computer science, taking a look at what the research says for how many, for example, women are in the field. And the intent of this question is to show that the PI has recruited a team that is responding to the underrepresentation of women in particular in this case. However, New Frontiers specifically states when completing the EDI section of the New Frontiers applications, a PI must protect the privacy and confidentiality of all team members because how an individual self-identifies is considered personal and confidential information and should not be disclosed without the person's consent. So information that identifies personal information or a self-identifying information of any team member may result in the application, in this case, being either having that section redacted or being withdrawn from the competition completely. So instead, New Frontiers requests that researchers give concrete examples of clear and specific actions or initiatives that the team has undertaken or will undertake to realize its equity, diversity, and inclusion related goals. And a move towards, as a side note, a move towards concrete examples or actions is a trend that you're seeing across other NSERC grants as well. I'm going to be focusing mostly during this presentation on these concrete actions, examples of promising practices, as this is again the growing trend that EDI considerations are focused in this area, and also a question that asks about gender balance may be more self-explanatory than those more complex or nuanced questions asking for EDI considerations in specific areas. It's important also, before we go on, to note that EDI requirements and considerations are newer in grant applications and have evolved over the last number of years, and likely will continue to evolve over the next coming years. So again, I would say that each time you apply to a grant, even if you've done so before, make sure that you're looking at the updated equity-related requirements, as they may have changed, as will best practices or promising practices. To provide you with a bit of an update on, or a bit of an overview on the representation of members of equity-seeking groups in computer science, I'm going to refer to a few examples from research. According to a Statistics Canada report released in 2019, women made up 44% of first-year STEM students in undergraduate degree programs in 2010. And whereas they accounted for almost 2/3 or 64% of students in non-STEM programs. And among STEM programs themselves, in that subset, the participation of women was lowest in computer and information sciences at 16%. And this is in comparison to the overall Canadian population that includes 50.9% women. So you can see that based on statistics, there is a fairly significant underrepresentation of women in computer and information sciences, particularly looking at that first year of undergraduate programs. A report completed, moving on, to behalf of Compute Canada, based on Ontario's context, focusing on people working in advanced research computing, found that among those with both the ability in computer tools and techniques and an understanding of the conceptual research, so that was the group they were looking at, they found that participation rates of young women had actually declined over time in those fields. And now again, this sample goes beyond academia to include not only academia, but other fields that advanced researchers are working in. But this is still useful for providing a relevant backdrop for understanding why it's important to support equitable training environments and to ensure that equity-related considerations are included in research design. The same report found that diversity for immigrant and visible minority groups is high, but some groups are underrepresented and earnings are not equal, meaning that when you disaggregate this data, looking at visible minority groups, for example, Filipino or Black members had the lowest participation rate, which calls attention to a need for the disaggregated data. And that also for some groups, income earnings were 43% or 64% compared to, say for West Asian men, 43% earnings compared to white men, or for Black men, 64% compared to their white counterparts. So again, calling attention to the need of looking into why this is, what are their barriers, and how can we address these as we move forward with creating an inclusive team environment and training environment. NSERC Alliance, New Frontiers and Ideas all ask researchers to consider equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations or gender-based analysis plus considerations in the research design itself. Gender-based analysis plus is an analytical process used to assess the impact of initiatives, such as research design, on diverse groups of women, men, and people with diverse gender identities, taking into account multiple identity factors. So the plus goes beyond gender to examine other identity factors. While folks using this analytical process, if they're new to it, often focus on gender, the plus really does refer to all of those other categories that you can pay attention to going back to that original definition of diversity. So you can also examine research design in terms of the participation or relevance to racialized groups, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and each of those other categories. For those who this analytical process is quite new to, I would recommend completing the Status of Women Canada's GBA Plus module. I'm gonna, again, provide a brief overview here, but to really dig into it, I think that training module really provides a good additional background information and can be completed fairly quickly and online. Also, I'd recommend referring to full case studies available through Stanford University's Gendered Innovations Project, which provides specific case studies related to various disciplines, including computer science. Offering an example related to computer science that you can read more about through that site is the example they provide related to the fact that translation systems like Google Translate, quote, massively overuse masculine pronouns, including he and him, even where the text specifically refers to women. And the unintended impact of that is that this has led to the overall less accurate translation for Google Translate. So this is something that they provide as an example of why a gender-based analysis plus is important and how it could have been used to prevent that, but also now how after the fact it can be used to improve that. So what is a gender-based analysis plus? Well, it's asking some key questions and going through it step by step to really analyze your research design. So again, this is focused on research design itself. When considering your research design, methods, analysis, and interpretation, and/or dissemination of research findings, ask yourselves the following questions. Again, these are questions adapted from the New Frontiers EDI Best Practice Guide, which I really recommend as a resource. So first question, are sex, biological, or gender sociocultural considerations taken into account? Are race and ethnicity considerations taken into account? Are other identity factors taken into account? So this could be, say, ability, rural versus urban identity, age. Sorry, I missed one. Does my research engage Indigenous peoples or communities? And if it does, it's important to consider specific best practices related to partnering with Indigenous peoples or communities in research, as those resources are very important and also very available online for those who do want to work in partnering with Indigenous peoples. If the research is using population data, can it be disaggregated by identity factors to determine differences between groups? Going back to our previous example of the representation of members of visible minority populations in computer science itself, computer science fields, we can see that when you disaggregate that data, while it looks like computer science is a field that really includes a lot of newcomers or members of visible minority groups, when you disaggregate, that there are definitely differences between subgroups. And that's why it's important to have disaggregated data if it's relevant. Finally, is there diversity in the work consulted and referenced in supporting or secondary research? Have you looked at diverse authors? Have you looked at research that also considers equity-related components of research design to ensure that those are reflected in your literature review? Now, if you answer yes to any of these questions, describe how identity factors you analyzed above will be considered in your research project. So again, going back to in my design or methods, analysis, interpretation, dissemination of research, this is how these considerations will be reflected or should be considered, and then provide that description. While I, through experience, find that researchers who do find these identity factors are relevant to a portion of their research are in a position where they are more able to provide this analysis, it doesn't mean that if your answers are no, that you have not completed this analysis. It's actually in asking these questions thoroughly and very carefully that you're completing the analysis. So if you answer no to these questions, Explain why identity factors are not applicable in your research proposal or project. And also, if applicable, commit to conducting further gender-based analysis plus prior to dissemination of research findings, because while it may not be applicable in research design itself, it could be very applicable for who this project will benefit. Maybe one population more than another, or more one area of, for example, Canada than another, rural versus urban. I know the little quote on this slide is quite dense to get through, but for a number of areas of this presentation, I'm providing brief case studies, not to use as templates, because of course your context will differ and you don't want to form response, but just to provide something that you can go back to when you're developing your own, particularly in the case where you're having trouble providing evidence that you've completed this analysis, if you do feel that your research is technical and does not contain relevant identity considerations that are equity related. So to provide an example of what I would write in that case, the PI or co-PIs have completed the Status of Women Canada GBA Plus training module prior to starting the research design for the project. The PI and co-PIs conducted a GBA Plus analysis of the research design and found no GBA Plus considerations to be relevant at this time as the research focuses on. And then I would include key objectives so that the reviewers are very clear on why this is the case, what objectives you have, which is not anticipated to be impacted by bias or barriers because, and then provide a description related to design methods, analysis, and interpretation, whichever is most relevant, so that not only are you being specific, but you're really supporting the reviewer's understanding why this is the case. And then further GBA Plus will be completed prior to the research dissemination as the project is expected to benefit, and again, provide specifics. So in this example, even though the researchers are saying no, the GBA Plus considerations or EDI related considerations are not relevant, they provided a thorough explanation as to why, starting with having completed training, which will provide you with a better understanding of what it is, so that reviewers know that you're saying no, but it's based on knowledge of what the analysis itself is. You're not just saying, no, it's not a factor. You're saying it's not because of specific objectives and because of specific parts of the research design that don't lend themselves to these identity considerations. And also committing to further GBA Plus analysis if it is relevant for parts of the research, including dissemination. Again, I know that this is quite a dense slide, but I'm providing these case studies for these portions as the recorded webinar will give you something to look back on if you are in the place of putting in these kinds of portions in your own grant applications. Again, as we move on to concrete examples of not only GBA Plus analysis, but now moving to the research team and training environment, it's very important that you're putting in concrete actions or analysis that you're genuinely committed to including in your team environment, because the overall purpose is for a funding application is of course to get funding, but also more broadly, as we can see in the strategic alignment that we've discussed earlier for different grant opportunities, the actual benefit of including EDI in research design and your training environment is to increase innovative research, diversity in the research field, and support better research outcomes and experiences for members of equity-seeking groups. I would also encourage that you consider building your team with EDI in mind, no matter what research project you're starting, in order to build a track record of successful EDI practices. And similarly to the fact that you'd like to build a record of success with training HQP, including undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral fellows, you want to build a track record of success for implementing EDI in your team environment as well. When you're looking to embed EDI in the research team and training environment, you're focusing on 4 key areas, including team composition and management, recruitment, selection, and hiring processes, training, development, and mentorship, and the inclusive team environment. I'm going to go over some best practices or promising practices for each of these 4 key areas in turn. Before we move forward, I've hyperlinked here the unconscious bias training module available from the tri-agencies. I recommend starting with this module to provide yourself an additional background, as it will help you to understand the impact of things like bias and peer review, as well as areas where you can further explore and identify your own unconscious biases, so that once they are identified, you can also mitigate them in your own research team or training environment as you move forward.
Jenny?
Yes?
Will these slides be available to everyone after the talk?
Yes, definitely. I think that.
I got a couple of questions, so thank you.
Okay, good. Sorry, I'm not seeing the questions. Feel free to ask anything else as we go along too.
Well, actually, there were a couple of other questions. Can I ask now?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so one of the questions is, do you think we should write about visible minorities or racialized groups? And should we discuss minorities in Canada, minorities in computer science, or minorities in our subfield of computer science?
So I would say that best practice would be to refer to racialized groups. However, the federal government, including many granting agencies, still use the term visible minorities. So if you want to align that way, you can still do that as well. When you're talking about the context of the fields, I think that you should provide as much research background on context as is relevant to the actions that you're going to be implementing. So I suppose if it is available, because I will say there's a lack of available data related to equity kind of across the board, but if you can find it for your subset of computer science research, that would be most useful, because it gets very specific and tangible, and then you are going to be implementing concrete actions that are most useful for your specific environment. If you can't find that information, I would go more broadly to computer science overall, and if you can't find that, look at broader still with STEM related equity context or research. And in terms of the environment, I would say, again, if you can get specific to your province, what the context is there, or at your institution, then use that. But then again, if it isn't available, go Canada or even globally if it provides relevant background to why you're identifying certain issues as barriers that you'll be addressing.
Thank you.
I know we're pretty tight on time, so I'll leave the questions there until we get to the end to make sure I get through all the content.
Perfect.
So we don't.
Thanks very much.
Great. So I know that was a little bit of a non-answer answer. It's kind of a little bit of it depends, because again, we don't have as much data specific to each field as we would like. And I think that's definitely an area that needs to be changed going forward, and obviously will continue to be a focus of attention. But I would say use as specific information as you can to your own team environment or research field, and then go more broad if it's not available, to provide a bit of that understanding or background insofar as you can build that picture. So turning to the research team and training environment, which is the first of that, or no, to start unpacking that and what you include there. Focus on providing examples of concrete actions that you intend to implement in your research team and training environment. So again, it's very important that you're not just including good actions, but you're actually committed to implementing them, because that would be quite key. To develop actions, consider what are the specific barriers the action is intended to address. So again, this is where using data or research to support is very important if possible. So if you can find it for as specific of a context as you can get. Then talk about the relevance to your team or institutional environment. So it could be that you're going to be focusing on anti-racism initiatives in your research team, and really focusing on making your team environment very inclusive for racialized groups, and that if there is institutional action or campus action towards anti-racism, that provides a solid backdrop for providing the reviewer with information that shows that you have a likelihood of success implementing this initiative within your team, because you have larger institutional support. So you don't necessarily only need to be focused on the barriers, but also the good things that are happening to push forward equity-related concerns in your team or institutional environment based on what's happening, and what you will really leverage or pick up on to make sure that you are successful. So don't only just think about the challenges or barriers, but also what is happening that you're really going to join in on and really push momentum forward with. And again, talk about the approach you will use to implement. So if you're talking about implementing a complaints management process to address equity-related concerns, build that out with details so it's clear to reviewers that you've quite thought it through and you're not just saying you'll do it without thought given to how that will actually be implemented. If you build out some of those details, it will become more clear for those who are reviewing your grant. And then finish with pulling the thread through to talk about the anticipated impact of the action on your team. If you're talking about, for example, encouraging HQP to contribute to events available through the Indigenous Student Center, what is the anticipated impact? If you build that through to say, the PI is committed to encouraging HQP to leverage programming and resources available through the Indigenous Student Center to ensure an inclusive training environment, and that the PI and research team is contributing to local efforts for indigenization on campus. So you can give like a bit more of an example of, or build that out, really, why are you doing this? What do you expect is going to happen because of it? Moving on to team composition and management. Again, we're going to be going over these 4 areas with best practices and case studies for each. Ask yourself, what measures and safeguards will you implement to ensure EDI principles are key considerations in the composition and management of your team? For example, you could, and these are the promising practices here, you could familiarize yourself with EDI initiatives, policies, and programs at your institutions. If you are talking about ensuring that all of your HQP are familiar with and adhere to equity-related employment policies, then take a look at the policies of your institution, which are likely available online, open them up and read certain parts of them so that you can really draw that out. So not only are you actually familiar with the policy and the content so that you know you're following it, but that you're providing that context for the reviewer so that they know, again, you've done your due diligence and really looked into, for example, the fact that there's a employment-related policy that prevents discrimination against protected groups. You can look at, again, EDI campus initiatives. Maybe there's anti-racism events or celebration for the participation of women in STEM. Anything that can really support resources for the overall context of your team when you're developing that team composition and management. Consider making a strong statement and a commitment to EDI as a PI in your training plan. Formalize a complaints management process. Again, when you're composing your team, if you're working with co-PIs, that may not be your case, but if you are, then consider putting a complaints management process in place for how you will address any equity-related concerns that may emerge. Recruit co-PIs, if you will be recruiting a larger team, who have made contributions to EDI. So by contributions, that may include things like public lectures, contributions in, say, women in computer science conferences, or conducted research that includes equity-related concerns. That will be particularly important if your research also would benefit from someone who has those skills. And then consider also assigning a management team member to be responsible for EDI objectives. You will be listing a number of EDI objectives in your training plan, and it will be very beneficial to ensure that you are assigning someone who has oversight so that if something goes off the rails, you know whose responsibility it is to ensure that that is corrected. So again, this is a very dense slide, but this is why the slides will be available after, just so you can go back to a bit of a case study. These are going to be broad case studies because they aren't going to include specific institutional context. So I do recommend that you still dig in a little bit more specifically when you do your own. The PI is strongly committed to ensuring an inclusive team environment that supports a diverse team of HQP through implementing concrete actions. The management team for the project includes PI and co-PIs with direct experience in EDI, as demonstrated through the PI's participation in leading an anti-racism campus task force, leading to 52 recommendations implemented across campus. To ensure the team is prepared to address equity-related concerns among team members, a complaints management process has been established and will be communicated to the team. All complaints will be brought forward to the identified EDI lead, who has received specific complaints management training. Concerns that cannot be addressed internally will be escalated to the equity office for additional consultation. So now that I've provided this brief case study, I'm going to point out some specific aspects or actions that have been included. First is that a strong commitment to specific actions implemented for the team composition management towards EDI. The fact that PIs were recruited with EDI related experience, and then a specific example. So provide that example so the reviewer knows what that experience is. And then implementation of a specific complaints management process that you provide detail on, including that it has been communicated broadly and that specific training has been received, and how concerns will be escalated if it cannot be handled internally on the team. So it's clear that you've thought about what that complaints management process looks like. When you move on to recruitment processes, consider what safeguards you will put in place to ensure the recruitment of team members is open and transparent and aligned with best practice to minimize bias and barriers. So here it's not about proving the diversity of your team by providing the numbers. And again, this is because providing numbers doesn't respect the confidentiality of those members or HQP on your team, and particularly if you're guessing about trainee demographic information, it's subject to potentially inaccurate assumptions. And where self-ID data is collected, it should be done with best practices in place, ensuring privacy and voluntary submission of data and a number of other factors. So what I recommend focusing on is implementing concrete actions for inclusive recruitment strategy. For example, adhere to EDI-related policies. Again, open up those employment-related policies and take a look at what is relevant for your team environment. Broadly distribute job opportunities. So this means posting job opportunities for 30 days, if possible, 30 days or more, and distributing through multiple opportunities, including things like the project website, word of mouth, social media, professional associations. Include professional associations of underrepresented groups. So say women in computer science groups. Through broad distribution, you can support broader uptake of diverse community members or diverse members of equity-seeking groups who may not be as likely to see these opportunities if you're only going through, say, who you know channels, because that'll get to who you already know and not those who you do not know how to reach. You also may want to consider developing inclusive job ads, which can be done a number of ways, including using ungendered language, so not using he or him or she or her, including a territorial land acknowledgement, noting that career leaves will be taken into consideration. So for example, noting that this will be relevant for those who have a gap on their CV because of parental leave or sick leave, and including a proactive offer for reasonable accommodations. So this could be for persons with disabilities to access content in alternative formats during the hiring process, or also accommodations for those who observe certain faith-based practices or holidays who cannot schedule an interview at a specific time or on a date. Now, these examples really speak to practices that may not be relevant for your context. We know that recruitment happens differently across different departments and institutions, and that you may be recruiting only from a small pool of graduate students in your department, for example. And in this case, you would want to include concrete actions that speak to this context. So an equitable recruitment process may mean establishing a standard set of selection criteria based only on the experience and skills required for the role, and using these criteria to evaluate all potential candidates consistently. This practice helps to reduce the potential impact of unconscious bias, which may come into play if candidates are asked different questions or evaluated without specific guidelines established prior to selection begins. To ensure that the unconscious bias of any one PI or co-PI is mitigated against, you may also consider creating a selection committee. Again, this would only be relevant if you had co-PIs working with you or a larger group, say maybe a postdoc already recruited. But having more than one person evaluate potential candidates for HQPs or other team members helps to reduce the potential impact of any one person's biases that they may not realize have come into play. Another thing you can do is complete the unconscious bias training that was linked on a previous slide prior to selection, because again, this will help you to understand and identify your own potential biases. An example of recruitment processes in a bit of a case study. The PI or co-PIs have completed the tri-agency's unconscious bias training module to help identify the researchers' unconscious biases prior to recruitment and selection. As the PI is recruiting from within the department, broad recruitment was not possible. However, the opportunity was communicated openly through email to all incoming graduate students and promoted during an introductory welcome session. The PI developed a series of selection criteria based only on the required skills for the role prior to selection began. As gender was identified as a relevant factor for the project during the GBA Plus analysis, experience with gender-based research will be considered an asset during selection. Selection will be determined by a selection committee made up of 3 management team members to ensure that individual bias of any one team member is mitigated. So here you can see training was completed prior to selection. The PI noted that broader recruitment was not possible, but to the degree which it was possible, it was openly communicated through both an email and welcome session. There was criteria developed prior to selection, and it reached back to the gender-based analysis plus that was completed, noting that expertise with gender-based research would be a relevant consideration for a new HQP coming on for the specific research. Finally, the decision for hiring will be made by a selection committee, and it got into specifics, noting that 3 management team members would contribute. For training and development and mentorship, consider what approaches will you use to ensure development and training opportunities are equitably distributed in your team. For example, require EDI-related training for all HQP to ensure that all understand the importance of an inclusive training environment and all understand the impact of systemic barriers and unconscious biases in the research enterprise. Provide information on mentorship programs. In your team, you'll likely be wanting to develop your own mentorship program or own mentorship goals for your HQP. However, you can also use existing resources that may exist in your institution to help better support, peer support, or mentorship for members of equity-seeking groups that may exist for those who are interested. So again, it could be an anti-racism committee or an LGBTQ2+ committee, anything that you have on campus that may be of interest to your team members. You can promote this through an email or through a bit of a welcome package that, again, just speaks to already existing resources. Keep a record of all training opportunities and communicate all opportunities broadly and transparently. Here, you're looking at opportunities including mentorship or partnership with an industry partner, conference presentations, support for developing publications. If you're tracking these opportunities and communicating them broadly, you have a better chance of ensuring that they're equitably distributed among team members, and that to the degree someone is interested in accessing these opportunities, they have the chance. You may also want to specify that you will provide financial support for training and development, including, for example, attending a conference to ensure that financial barriers aren't a limitation, and ensure that the workload of HQP providing mentorship is balanced. So this is particularly important where a senior HQP, say a postdoc or PhD student, is going to be taking on a formal role in mentoring a more junior HQP. If that is the case, then you don't want the person taking on mentorship to be just swamped with work. You want them to have an effective work-life balance. So that that is the approach you will be using. Be mindful of redistributing workloads accordingly. A case study bringing together a number of these elements. All HQP will be required to complete equity training available through the institution to ensure all understand the importance of an equitable and inclusive research team environment. HQP will be encouraged to explore available mentorship programs, including Women in Computer Science. The PI will provide a monthly email promoting training opportunities. The PI will keep written records of completed training and development to ensure that all HQP are provided with equitable support. All postdocs will receive funding for one international conference, while the graduate students will receive funding for one national conference to ensure financial limitations do not present a barrier to participation. Senior HQP, including the postdocs and PhD students, will be expected to mentor junior HQP through formalized mentorship roles. All HQP taking on mentorship roles will have their workloads redistributed to ensure that an adequate work-life balance is maintained. So here you can see required completion of equity-related training. Encouraging mentorship programs are used. You'll want to be familiar with specific resources on your campus. Transparent promotion of mentorship opportunities and support for training opportunities. So you don't have to say that all HQP will have the same resources, because that may not make sense for the level they're at. But if you specify how they will be distributed at the outset, it ensures that it's not just your favorite person getting and benefiting from all of the resources. Finally, inclusive training environment. Consider what measures will you put in place to ensure team members from equity-seeking groups feel they belong. Some promising practices include providing information on EDI-related policies, campus resources and supports. Campus resources and supports may be extensive, including on-campus Indigenous Student Center, student groups, equity office, also resources including on-site daycare, multi-faith spaces, inclusive washrooms. All of these things could be relevant resources and likely may be compiled for you already on your institution's website. You could also address equity-related conflicts and microaggressions that occur between HQP quickly, and this would be very important, particularly when you have a conflicts management process in place. Hold regular meetings to allow HQP to communicate their needs, and provide alternative meeting formats and dates and times to accommodate things like caregiving duties. Don't have meetings at 8 o'clock at night that make it difficult to balance caregiving, or also consider Zoom meetings for those who have travel limitations. Obviously, that's very relevant during current pandemic times as well. And finally, encourage participation in campus equity initiatives to ensure team members understand the importance of an inclusive environment. If there are those campus events that are tailored to certain equity-related issues or celebrations, consider promoting these, because it helps your HQP know that you know it's important and are valuing those efforts on your campus. So this final case study, weekly team meetings will be scheduled to ensure HQP are able to provide updates on their workload and discuss any emerging issues, including equity-related concerns. Meetings will be intentionally scheduled during core business hours. Core business hours are between 10 and 3. And avoid days and times that conflict with faith-based practices of team members. Virtual meeting options will be provided for team members with caregiving duties or travel limitations. All team members will be provided with information on available campus resources, including how to access bursaries for parental leave, location of multi-faith spaces, and inclusive washrooms. Team members will be encouraged by the PI to contribute to campus events, including, and then again, provide specifics based on availability. The promising practices included here, again, provide you a bit of a case study, but to ensure it's detailed and relevant to your context, it will be important for you to familiarize yourself with resources available in your own institution, and also match the resources that you're recommending or including to the barriers that you've earlier identified, so that it's not only relevant for your team environment, but also for, say, your area of computer science. Prior to jumping in the questions, since these slides will be available, I've hyperlinked a few equity, diversity, and inclusion resource guides that I would recommend taking a look at, that not only have additional promising practices, but also recommended research if you would like to learn more about any one area of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So these are the guides from the Canada Research Chairs Program, New Frontiers, and NSERC. I know that I haven't left a lot of time for questions, so we can take a few questions and I'll get to as many as we can. And where we don't get to them, I'd be happy to work with Adele to make sure we develop a bit of an FAQ after that can be posted with these slides.
Thanks, Jenny. That was so rich with information, and I'm really grateful to you for sharing the slides. Someone just asked when we'll be how I'll be distributing the slides. I will send copies of the slides to everyone who registered for the presentation. The recording of the webinar will be available on our website. So for those people whose colleagues weren't able to join, you can point them to the recording. And you and I can work on an FAQ, and I'll send that out also to everyone who registered for the webinar. We're almost out of time. So one of the quick questions that I wanted to ask was, well, whether we will be able to have access to the source for the Canadian stats.
Yes, definitely. I can provide those in the FAQ as well.
Great, thank you. I don't think we have, I mean, some of these questions are really long and would need a thorough answer. So I think we're better off doing them through an FAQ. One of the notes that I had from someone was, I'm going to find it now. We've had some very good comments about the thing, but just that we need to be careful not to use the great examples as templates, because that might affect the credibility of any statement. So just to be careful about using the examples that you provided in whole as templates when people are putting together grant applications. So I think.
Yes, definitely. I was a little tentative about providing case studies. I wanted to provide enough specifics, but it is important that, and this speaks to also the fact that you need to be very much genuinely committed to implementing these concrete actions. It's not just about getting the grant funding, it's also about implementing them, which is why it's important to not use this as a form, because it also needs to be specific to your context and something that you are committed to implementing.
Right. And someone just asked if we can submit questions for the FAQ other than right now. Absolutely. I'll send out a note to everyone right after the webinar ends, letting them know that if they have questions, they can send them to me over the next day or so. And then Jenny and I can work on putting together a full FAQ to go up on the website along with the slides and the recording next week.
And where you feel, if for anyone on the webinar still, if you feel that you have a question that is more specific to you, feel free to note that and I can answer it directly.
Yeah, and there are a few like that I'll pass along to you.
Great.
Great. Thanks everyone for participating. I really appreciate Jenny, your time and all the work that you put into the presentation. And thanks for all the positive comments and the suggestions. I really appreciate from all of the participants. And I'll look forward to providing all this information to everyone and all our members on the website. So thanks everyone. Take care.